The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. It doesn't really feel like we've been away because we've done so many episodes across the off-season, but this definitely feels like kind of coming back in a way because it's the season opener and it's our first chance for JR and I to really get our teeth into a race and do one of our signature race review analysis. So welcome back, JR. It's nice to have you back. And on this episode, we're going to look at, obviously, Josef Newgarden's victory. Spoiler alert, if you've not watched the race yet, you're probably listening to the wrong podcast, but you can definitely pause the pod and go back and watch the race now if you want to. We've got definitely some interesting elements of Josef's win that we want to get into across his team, Penske, and a little bit of kind of Josef's mindset going into this year, which seems to have changed a little bit, or at least we're getting some kind of insight into how he's approaching this year in more detail than we maybe would have had in the past. We've also got some other interesting elements of the race. A really weird race for Ganassi. It's reigning champion Alex Palou and some of its new drivers, and some very difficult performances for Romain Grosjean and Marcus Ericsson across the St Pete weekend as well. Difficult to analyse because they're so up and down. We're going to get into all of those very shortly. JR, I want to start by getting into the race a little bit because although it was a massive crowd, there was a lot of excitement going into the season opener. It's clear that the drivers were really excited to get back on track. It was clear that the media and the fans were really excited to have the race back. So I preface my next point with all of that. But for me, it felt like the race was just a little bit of a damp squib, just a little bit lacking in some action in places. I want to throw this to you because I'm kind of wondering if we're getting to a point where we've had the DW12 for a little while now, as we all know, and the benefits of that is obviously closing the pack up, making sure that the racing's close together. It's like a faux BOP, if you like. Obviously, the teams get to a certain point with the chassis where there's not a whole lot more they can do. They can only make small tweaks, and that in turn means that the field comes close together. I wonder if we're getting to a point where the field is too close, and we saw it in qualifying where, it was much less than a tenth of a second separating some of the cars. We had people missing out by 0.00 something of a second in qualifying, whether that was graduating to a session or even pole was separated by that margin between Josef Newgarden and Felix Rosenqvist. I just wonder if we've gone past the point where having continuity is a good thing and it keeps things close together, and we've got to the point where things are just too close together now that it's difficult for people to pass. It's, everyone's so familiar with what they've got underneath them that it kind of makes things difficult. Or maybe you can talk a little bit about that race itself, because when you've got obviously a fuel saving race like we've had there, I think a lot of that plays into it, and it's maybe not time to hit the panic button about what we're going to see in IndyCar this season. But quite a lot of points for you to get stuck into there. I wonder how much you feel that the continuity of the car is to blame for that race, and how much of it you feel is like a race specific kind of a lot of fuel saving going on and kind of taking away a little bit from maybe some of the drama.
Yeah, I think it is actually kind of just like a meta question about IndyCar more broadly, I think, at this point, really. But I'll approach it from both directions. One being like just this race versus this race in the past or something or whatever, and then maybe more broadly, what does it say about IndyCar and kind of where we're all at. I saw Marshall posted earlier, this is the 200th race for the Dallara DW12 chassis. So to your point, plenty of time for everybody. He made mention of the fact that maybe it is the like race chassis that has been in use for the longest in like the history of, dare I say, the history of motorsport, or certainly the history of modern motorsport.
It sounds silly to say out loud, but then I can't think of anything that would be longer.
Yeah,
so.
I was kind of like, surely that's not the case, but then I was sitting there thinking about it. It's like,
because even like Formula Ford, they would bring out a new car each year. So even though it's roughly the same formula, you've got new cars coming out every year. Well,
and you sort of think like, oh, there must have been some time back in history where they raced the same thing, but that's just not how it ever worked. Like spec cars are in essence a new thing. So we've only been doing spec car racing of any variety, really. And kind of to your point, like even Formula Ford had competition among a couple of manufacturers or something for decades. And like still does, right? So anyway, a topic for another day maybe, but I think probably our audience knows how I feel about these things by now. But I guess I would say, this race, we just kind of look at St. Pete. It's been a crazy race in the past because it's been a crazy race, because there's just been like crazy stuff that happens, and there's a lot of cautions, and you get, you get the odd red flag, you get, multiple cautions that are in the middle of stints. So they factor in just to pack the field back up and kind of, resort and reset, red tires versus, or alternates versus primaries in a different way and that kind of stuff. This is a race where that basically just didn't really occur. It happened once. I guess after the first round of pit stops, we had another caution in there that sort of basically just bunched everybody back up, but it didn't ultimately end up like really affecting, where people were at on the, alternate versus the primary or whatever. Like, so I guess I say that in part just to say this did turn into a fuel strategy race, or it didn't turn into a fuel strategy race, just it's turned into a fuel save race, which naturally you're going to have a lot less just wheel to wheel guys going flat out battling for laps end on end. You saw a lot of brief moments where guys were on the button, like trying to get by the car in front of them. And if that didn't work, if they didn't make that happen within a couple of laps, they were like back into huge fuel save mode. So part of it was, I think, sort of circumstantial that there wasn't more racing going on. And then in essence, you saw throughout the second and third stints to the end that anytime you went on anybody's onboard, they were saving fuel. So all the way to the end of the race, like all the way to lap, 100 or whatever. And so that's for sure part of it. The other part of it is that it's also just a hard track to pass on. Like I thought it was interesting this year more than I've noticed in the past. Not only kind of was there seemed like a lot of difficulty just under braking generally for guys. Like they brought it up often on the broadcast, and St. Pete is, if you get a little bit, if the wind is in a weird direction, like it made me wonder if the wind was kind of tail crosswind for turn 9, and then at the end of the kind of quote unquote back straight, and then that ends up being a little bit of a tailwind into turn 1 also, which is kind of where you tended to see guys having issues, almost no issues during the race for cars going into turn 4. So that would kind of jive, like if maybe you had a little headwind into 4 but it was kind of a tailwind in the other places or something like that. But that makes, if that's the case, that makes sticking passes in those places even more difficult. And it struck me that particularly down the front straightaway, there was a lot of guys bailing on passes, and it seemed to me like it was basically just because the paint on the runway was like, if you were offline trying to go deep into turn 1, that it was like, I mean, I don't recall in the past seeing quite so many instances of guys looking like they've got a pretty good run, pulling out, being seemingly alongside enough, and then basically just getting outbraked by the car on the racing line. So we're recording, shortly after the race. I haven't had a time to text anybody and kind of find out like what was going on with that. Like there were some little things that stuck out during the race to me that just made me curious. Like, why was that going on? That I think only a driver in the race would really be able to answer. But so I guess it's all to say there were some factors like that made this less pass heavy, less interesting from like a man-to-man combat kind of perspective than even St. Pete tends to be. I mean, you tend to get into situations at St. Pete where at some point in the race, everybody's super close together and it just seems like mayhem, cars side by side through 5 corners in a row, like, halfway getting punted and whatever. And I think mainly just because of the fuel situation, that was much less the case. Like you just couldn't stay on the proverbial button, let alone the real push to pass button for very long, throughout the race. So that's part of it. The other part of it is for sure that this is just it is a racing formula at this point because it's a spec car, and we've had, and to your point that we've had the car for a long time. And I'll also say that there's just over the last even 3 or 4 years, let alone the last 10, that there's been a lot of movement of drivers and engineers in the paddock. So that also creates for, in essence, a lot of shared knowledge. And there's a lot of these, joint relationships now of teams within the paddock. So all of that creates for, in addition to at St. Pete specifically, a very short lap. That creates for just a kind of homogeneity in a way in terms of how similarly performing all of the cars are, and that we know that the level of talent in the driver lineups is just insanely stacked throughout the paddock. Like it's a whole bunch of specialists at IndyCar street course racing, basically, because there's a lot of guys that have been doing this and are really good at it and at good teams and all that kind of stuff. So there's not a lot of ways, to your point, for there to be like differentiation between entries, so I guess like pulling back a little bit further from that, I think to me the thing that I'll just continue to beat this drum because I think it's true in essence is that the cars aren't radical enough in any particular way for that all by itself to just be a differentiating factor. So they're very physical, but if you're an IndyCar driver, you know that it's very physical, so you can be prepared for that by the start of the season. It'd be a different thing if you just had half the grid from some other series show up. The fact that the cars were so physical would be like, oh my God, like by the end of the race, that's a real factor between who's doing what, because it's just super physical. But for these guys, it's not, or it's not significant. And that, like, again, like if the cars had another 300 or 400 horsepower or something, or they had a lot less downforce or whatever, you'd just have, I mean, if you're new to the pod or you're new to this, you're hearing me say that thinking like, oh, well, IndyCar already has less down, like they're more of the right, we'll call it the quote unquote right ratio of those things compared to like lots of other racing. And I would agree with that. That's true, but they're not so far in that direction in terms of how skewed that ratio is between power and grip, and particularly power and aero grip, that you have like, massive deg, or that the car is just so hard to drive that regardless of how good you are, you're just making like a lot of little errors and, really having to drive the hell out of the thing. So I think there's 10 different factors for why the qualifying lineup is so close, for why the race is so close, but there's not actually a lot of passing going on. But I think like in some respects, the core things that underpin that are just the nature of the series and the cars right now. So I guess while I started out explaining in a way like why this specific race was a lot of the way that it was, which is all true, there are things that make it so that like any IndyCar race could be like this, basically. Because, and even, Firestone is always involved in tweaking the tire compounds and doing that kind of stuff to try to create for a little bit more of that differentiation, like a little bit more of a variable, basically, that is hard to control and hard to really understand, hard to know exactly what you're getting into by the time you get into the race. That would be the type of thing that even in a race like this, if the guys on the alternate were like falling off a cliff by the end of, like, even the guys that were really good at hanging onto their tires were still like having a significant pace differentiation between beginning of the stint to the end of the stint or whatever. But I felt like though there were some cases over the race where you saw some guys start to like begin to lose a lot of pace towards the end of a stint. If anything, the difference between the tire compounds to me seemed more like you really just wanted to have the alternates underneath you for the start and restarts, basically. And that for the most part, the average top 10 driver and team and car were able to basically like make them last. So I say that I guess just to say, if we're looking at the rest of the season, little things like that, even being more dramatic in terms of how they affect a race, could make races like this much more interesting. But I think the closeness of the field and the likelihood that we end up getting in situations like this, just because of the dynamic with, to your point, how long everybody's had their hands on this thing, and then and how close the manufacturers are. I mean, that's worth kind of pointing out as another part of this, that feels very much like Honda and Chevy are like just absolutely neck and neck kind of in terms of what they're bringing to the table, which is also a function of the fact that they've been doing this for 12 years. There's just not a lot that they can, it's a lot of little tweaking, basically. So it'll be interesting. So I guess I say all of that to say, I'm sure we'll have races that are much more exciting than this. But I would I just have the feeling watching these practice sessions and races over the last several years now that it's kind of like, okay, we're kind of just watching the same thing, like there isn't much that's changing. So I don't have the expectation that we're going to it's going to suddenly feel that way or something, you know?
The tyre thing is worrying for me because I guess kind of what I heard coming out of the paddock and what I expected to be the case was different, in the sense that I didn't expect the tyres to be that different from last year. But the kind of noise coming from the paddock was that the soft tyre was last year's hard, and this year's hard was a harder compound. And the crux of that is because obviously IndyCar was expecting to have the hybrid unit with a lot more weight. They've made the tyres harder to be able to cope with that. But it's kind of like a double bad scenario for in this case, because you've got lighter, faster cars at the moment, and you're giving them harder tyres instead of... If you'd have just kept everything as it was last year and made the cars lighter, then they're going to wear the tyres more, and it's going to make things more interesting from a degradation point of view. So Will Power was right at the start of the weekend in practice when he said that the tyres are not degrading enough to help create, you know, more interesting racing. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that with Firestone. And I wonder if it was a case that they'd committed to St Pete in terms of the rubber that they decided to bring for the hybrid, and that maybe in some of the more upcoming races before the 500, they'll be able to change back to last year. Maybe they'll have the availability to do that. Obviously, they will have been, you know, making tyres for a year now based on what they expected to be the case, you know, coming into some of these races. So it'd be interesting to get with Firestone actually and find out a bit more about what their long-term plan is for, or maybe long-term is not quite the right way to phrase it, but the pre-hybrid strategy of tyres to see if that's going to mix things up a bit. I guess we should move on to our race winner, Josef Newgarden. It's his third win at St Pete. Penske's 12th at St Pete, which is an amazing number when you think about it, how many races we've had at St Pete, and Penske have won 12 of them. The last time Josef won this race, he won the championship. So a very interesting kind of mix of things happening here for Josef. The first one being that he went all of last year without a pole position and put that right with a pretty stonking performance in qualifying to put himself on the front row. And then in the race, it just never really felt like he was going to lose that race, especially when he was pushed back a little bit in the pack there and started that second restart fourth and had to work his way, or the first restart that would have been, he had to work his way back up from fourth, and did it pretty with a bit of ease, really. He didn't find it too difficult. And then in the closing stages, as Pato struggled, it was kind of the perfect scenario because Pato held up Scott McLaughlin and Will Power, who had the same car as Josef Newgarden theoretically, but were on soft tyres, so could have really given Josef some trouble. But Josef was already 7 seconds up the road by any chance of that happening. So a really dominant performance. And I think what I wanted to get into with you, JR, is because you've spoken about this on the pod before, was there's been a little bit of talk about Josef's approach to this season. Obviously, he's been asked a lot more questions because he was on pole and now he's just won the race. So it's a good opportunity for the media to kind of grill him on his approach to the year, rather than, you know, him being a little bit more anonymous last year and not necessarily being at the front. He's not been spoken about as much. But yeah, basically, he has talked about not enjoying his racing, basically. He kind of alluded to that in one of the practice sessions, I think, and then he was asked about it in the post-race press conference and talked a little bit about what it's like to be a racing driver in terms of your mentality. Talked a little bit about the job versus kind of enjoyment element of being a racing car driver, and was keen to point out that he's very lucky to be a racing driver and that it's not a bad job to do, but also that it comes with a lot of pressure and a lot of expectation, and it comes with a lot of kind of internal mental struggles as well that it's sometimes difficult for drivers to compute. So without further ado, we'll head over and hear what Josef had to say about this in the post-race press conference.
I mean, I don't want to dive into it too aggressively, but it did start becoming a job. This is how I make my living, and it's how I provide for my family, and I'm showing up, and it's not a grueling job. I mean, anyone would be lucky to be in the position that I'm in, but if you're fortunate enough to be here and do this, you should enjoy it. It's a very difficult job at the end of the day too, because it's purely results based. It's hard to be in this type of job or position and know that you're either here or not here based on your results. I mean, you're either winning or you don't have your seat. I mean, that's literally how it works. So it's kind of hard to find that enjoyment factor and I'd always had it. I'd learned how to thrive in the pressure and still enjoy the job. And I think it just slipped away at one point. And, I was buried with a lot of other things, and I just tried to, simplify my life and get back to happiness. And I think I've done that in a lot of ways. I feel really happy. I feel motivated, and I'm enjoying showing up and seeing everybody with smiling faces, and let's do our best. But I hope we can win today. I think we can. And if we don't, that's all right. We'll figure it out the next time. So I'm kind of getting back to that point.
All right, Joe, I know you've addressed maybe not this directly in the same way that Josef has, because you've probably not been asked about this in the same way, but you've talked about this a lot on the pod at various points of your career where you've maybe felt like you've needed to take a step back. You've not quite been enjoying getting in the car as much as what you remember, whether it be when you were a kid or just even, early in your IndyCar career when everything's new and things are maybe there's a little bit less expectation, or at any point in your career where you feel like you've got a little bit less expectation, or either on yourself or from people on the outside maybe. I'm keen to kind of get your thoughts, because not only can you talk about that, but you also know Josef extremely well. And I think, we've spoken to Josef on the pod even, and I'm sure you've spoken to this about him, about it privately with him, but just how kind of mega detail orientated he is and how he kind of puts all of this weight on his shoulders. It's something we've discussed on the pod, that sometimes we feel like he takes too much on and puts too much of that kind of, I am the team performs with me, that kind of thing. And also just like the kind of meta detail that he kind of stores in his brain about setups and, contributing to all of that as well. For people who don't know, Josef's like sometimes remembers setups from like years ago and has all of this like kind of knowledge about what the car should be like going into different races and stuff, much more so than a lot of other drivers on the grid. So yeah, I guess you can speak on that a lot better than I can. But interested just to kind of get your feel for how you felt Josef was this weekend and some of those comments that he made.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like I'd be concerned if I was everybody else listening to the way that he spoke about some of these things.
Yeah.
And we've talked at length just because we have the good fortune of like talking to a lot of drivers, and it's partially because of the experience that I've had and just being a driver, you have a little bit of extra insight into like how much your, I don't know, just mentality and sort of psychological, emotional approach to driving the car. Like it's something that I think for a lot of us, you don't appreciate really when you first become a pro, that most of us, I think you kind of get to, you've made it to that point more or less just on like kind of talent and athleticism and having like the right kind of general approach or something. And for some guys that carries you. Some guys you never have to rethink it, I don't think, but for others, and I would certainly put myself in this camp, that you reach a point in your career at some point that either because things have not gone well or they're not going according to plan, or you just kind of realize it for yourself for one reason or another, that you kind of have to dig into it a little bit. Like, okay, like what am I missing here? Or like, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling about this? You at some point like zoom out. And in my case, that was kind of after having an okay season racing full time. I mean, it was partway through racing full time, the last time when I was racing for Ed, and just kind of like knowing that I wasn't, basically realizing that like I wasn't enjoying it, but not really, even when we were kind of doing well, like not really enjoying it. And but at the time, not really kind of realizing that I didn't really have the tools to figure out how to like turn that around either. Like I think it was the type of thing for me that even if I had raced again full time the next year, like it would have taken it, I needed to get to the off season to like figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And we've heard that a lot from, we spoke about that at length with Will Power.
Yep.
A couple of years ago before his championship season. We've talked about it with Marcus Ericsson lately. And then Josef. So kind of speaking about Josef, I want to kind of just like pick out a couple of parts of another quote of his, which are he was sort of just being asked about his mentality and like if it's championship or bust or whatever. And he says, I've had to let go of that mentality. I think it's too, there's no sustainability in my perfection. I'm definitely a perfectionist. I'm an introvert, but I get hyper fixated on just trying to maximize everything. I think my mentality was in a lot of ways win or nothing all the time or all the way throughout my career. That's just, even today, it was creeping in. I'm like, we're winning this race today or we're not winning it. I was just going to go for it or nothing. It is my mentality. From a bigger picture standpoint, I don't think that's sustainable. I'm not going away from my passion and my desire, but I'm trying to recenter my enjoyment in what I do. And he goes on to talk a little bit more specifically about, one of the things that he really enjoys outside of just driving the car is working with the team and kind of being a part of the problem solving process and the way that works. And that to me was just like, yes, like I not because we're buddies, but I just love hearing guys like figure this out, because for me, like I have not even been able to put this into practice meaningfully. Like I learned it too late in kind of like the phase of my career that, my career just went a different direction by the time I sort of figured this out. But I love hearing guys kind of figure this out for themselves, because I know how much of a difference it makes. I know what it feels like to kind of be on both sides of this. And for Josef specifically, it has just, we've talked about it. I mean, even though we're friends, like I felt okay, I guess, about like pointing it out here and there on the podcast that it does kind of feel like he's, maybe whatever. I don't want to like put too much of a specific, lens through it, but like, that he's kind of dependent on controlling variables that he just can't control, and that creates for this like all or nothing point of view on things when the reality is like you kind of got to be able to just go out and get what's there when it's there, and that you have to trust that that's all just going to add up, and that it's possible to have the same amount of conviction and intention for like what you're there to do without feeling like it's win or nothing, so I think that to me, I would say is the little wrinkle in all of this that is the hardest thing actually to like fully come around on, is when you've been successful in the past with this just win or go home mentality, which at some point, even for me, like when I won Indy Lights championship, it was like we were pissed if we came in second. Like there was just we were there to show up and stick the car on the pole and win the race. So even if that was a long time ago in my career, like if you make it to IndyCar, there's been some point where you were in a dominant situation and against other good guys, and so you kind of end up adopting that point of view, and it kind of works in those scenarios. But as soon as you're not quite in that environment or in that scenario, or you don't have all those things around you, having that just win all or nothing mentality is like distracting you a lot of time from just getting the most out of what's there, because you get to a point through every weekend that you realize you're not going to win, and weekends that you don't end up winning or that it's not on the table. And so that like totally screws up your whole approach. You end up like doing dumb things because you're trying to make up for something that like isn't actually there. And so we've talked a little bit about just like and I think a lot of the inconsistency that he's had over the last few years in terms of results like are not down to this. Like there's other good reasons why he and the two crew have just had inconsistent results. But
yeah, absolutely.
I think him just finding a little bit of alignment around what he really does enjoy about it and being more focused on trying to extract like maximum value out of those things, there's just no way that doesn't end up with him being better, I don't think. And him being better is like very dangerous for everybody else. And the only other thing I just want to add is that wasn't kind of in the post-race quotes, but was actually after qualifying, just listening to his, on TV, his post-race qualifying interview. He was kind of being asked about, having answered a question previous to the weekend or whatever about, what they needed to work on. And that being like, he was kind of pissed off that they didn't have any poles last year. And so needing to, reconcile that or whatever, which is the type of thing that immediately struck me like, well, that's probably not the right, way to look at that. But then when he actually talked about how they got through qualifying, he was just like, we just wanted to transfer out of the first group and then wanted to put a good lap in to transfer out of the second group. And then we were kind of see where things shook out. And Luke made some great calls and, basically everything just went according to plan, or like it worked out in essence. And I think that kind of more in the moment, like we're just going to go put our best foot forward here, basically, to me was very telling that he seemed, and sometimes it almost like surprises you that you end up on the pole or you end up like winning a race somewhat easily or seemingly easily when you're just focused on kind of putting one foot in front of the other because you haven't been like so hyper, whatever tuned into like, I gotta win. But it feels like probably for him, what is a very small adjustment. It just felt significant to me just watching it from the outside. And so I think for him, a little bit like for Will was a couple of years ago, just having had some kind of immediate success, bringing like a slightly different point of view to the table, will just give him a lot to work with in terms of kind of increasing the RPM on the tack for that versus like decreasing it and being able to tune that in a little bit as is required over the course of the season. So yeah, it was refreshing, I thought, to see, and definitely puts for me is enough to put him immediately in the I would have you asked me about this like on the last pod or in between pods or something for the race, like who I thought was going to win the championship, and I was kind of like, I don't really see any reason why Alex Palou won't just win the championship again. But I think one of my thoughts there was like, Josef has all the tools to do that, but I feel like he and his crew need to be in a slightly different mode somehow. Like they need to be able to just go out and like get whatever's there, and everything he did this weekend, not least of which winning the race and like being on the pole and winning the race, but just kind of the way that they seem to go about doing it, is exactly that.
Well, you mentioned a different mode. I guess one way of characterizing that would also be that it's the first time in 2 seasons that he has the same engineer coming into the season, and there's definitely, it's not just this. I mean, it's obviously what we've just talked about is a massive, it feels like a massive kind of point in his career, really, where he's realised what what you've outlined and what you've discussed in terms of his approach and just how he feels about his racing, but also having continuity to come into the season with the same people, or at least a very similar group of people, and not have all of that kind of distraction going on. Before the season is another big thing. I think I asked Josef about this after qualifying, and he played it down. But I feel like, I don't want to speak on Josef's behalf, but he's always very protective of his team and never likes to kind of, put them down in any way, or even, obviously I'm speaking on his behalf here again. It's not something that Josef said, but maybe just kind of like not wanting to make excuses or point to something that he feels is not necessarily a defining factor. But I think anyone would be affected by having 2 different engineers and 2 different engineers coming in like weeks before the season as well. I think anyone would be affected by that, regardless of what they say about it. So I kind of understood how Josef characterized it, and was kind of playing it down as something that isn't a big thing necessarily. But for me, I feel like it can only be a significant part of the equation of this kind of new Newgarden, let's call it.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with cash back match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
You mentioned Alex Palou. I'm kind of interested because I've seen a few people now kind of talking about Scary Newgarden and his performance over the weekend, but I kind of felt equally about Alex Palou after that race because he was nowhere for the whole, until the last pit stop of the race. He was for the whole weekend, he was just absent. He was nowhere. And that feels like the champion that Alex Palou is. I mean, for a start, I definitely think he should have had a penalty at the start of the race for ruining Christian Lundgaard's race, which was very disappointing for Christian. And I know Alex will, he didn't do that intentionally, and it was the start of the race where it's close quarters and these things can happen. But we have seen penalties given in those situations before, and I thought he was very fortunate to escape with any sort of penalty for that incident. But then even for the majority of the race, he was outside of the top 10 and behind Scott Dixon. And then he ran a little bit longer on the last pit stop, had a great stop, great in-lap and out-lap, managed to jump up to 7th and then passed Felix Rosenqvist quite quickly after the final pit stop and suddenly was in 6th. And I guess I went into the, while he was having these, let's not say struggles because we didn't know how the race was going to play out, but before the race, let's say, I was looking at where Alex was in the order and thinking, is he not that good at St. Pete? But he did finish second there in 2022. And his other results there have not been, particularly outstanding. But he's definitely, he's been on the podium there. So it's not a bad place for him to go. But just kind of turning that whole weekend round where maybe he wasn't struggling that much. Maybe it was just, a little kind of just being a little tiny bit off in that field was just enough to send you so far down the order that it, maybe it's not that big a deal that he was, starting in 13th or whatever. But I think the way he came back and delivered that 6th place was really super impressive and should be a bit of a worry to the rest of the field as well. That he's shown that he can do that. And it wasn't even like it took him all race because he was pretty much nowhere from it. It was that last pit stop where it all came together. It was just one pit stop. So that was quite telling. And I kind of wanted to pick up on Ganassi a little bit just because such a weird race for them. Marcus Armstrong, admitted to making a mistake at turn 10 where he locked up and went into the wall. And then we saw Linus Lundqvist do exactly the same thing. And initially on the broadcast, it looked like he'd done the same thing as Armstrong, but he was actually punted out of the race by Romain Grosjean in a really poor move that we'll get onto in a second. But also I wanted to mention Kyffin Simpson, because he was 14th and did a really good job on his IndyCar debut. He's someone who there's been a lot of attention on for probably the wrong reasons. Not many expectations on him coming into IndyCar. Someone who's obviously brought a lot of sponsors with him, and is maybe stepping into that seat ahead of people who've finished much better in Indy Next in the past. But to finish 14th on your IndyCar debut is really impressive. And we saw a few rookies and a few very experienced drivers getting caught out in that race. So a really strong performance from him. Really unlucky for Linus. And Scott Dixon was you kind of expected him to make the same kind of thing as Palou and move a little bit further forward, but he wasn't able to kind of make that happen, but still, finishing really strong. So a bit of a weird race for Ganassi. I was a bit I do if I was Ganassi, do kind of look at that race and just think how much of Penske found. And this is where you can get a little bit too granular in the detail of one race, and St. Pete's not really like necessarily the other street courses, and we'll go to Long Beach, which is quite a bit different. So it's difficult to start drawing comparisons or worrying too much about anyone. But I think the way Penske came out with 3 cars and Chevy locking out the top 4 with Pato being strong for McLaren as well, I do think at least we've got a really interesting battle sort of teed up here between Penske and Ganassi and their kind of lead drivers and how they've come out of this first race. I don't know if you had the similar kind of feeling or thought about it in that kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I guess just on the results alone, I wouldn't put like a lot of stock into it, but based on what guys were saying, I'm kind of ready to put some chips on the table. Just in that the fact that the Penske guys in particular spoke so highly of what Chevy's been able to do in the offseason, and just how much of a factor that seemed like it was to them. I mean, that's not just like PR talk. Like I don't think you have a number of guys bringing that. I mean, the last time that happened was 2 years ago. And it was sort of the coming out of the off season when Ray Gosselin had come over from Andretti to the Ilmore squad and kind of immediately, brought some definite advantage basically to the Chevy camp, just from I think being able to validate in a completely different way from a completely different context that what the drivers and teams are asking for was actually possible to do from having seen it on the Honda side. I think that's an easy way to just summarize kind of what happened there.
Yeah.
So I mean, I certainly recall that St. Pete race thinking I'm really glad that drivability was not my drinking word for this race, because I would have been shit-faced halfway through the first practice session with all the Chevy guys talking about how much better the drivability was. But this felt a little bit similar to me, like that they've answered the bell basically. And so particularly for for Penske, sometimes that's all Penske needs is just a little help from somewhere for them to really be in a position to crush. I mean, it was interesting. I have a whole new appreciation for, just the level of, resources that some of these teams have compared to others after talking to Gavin Ward, this past week. So, when I think that when that pod drops, we'll have a little, you'll be able to sort of reference, or have some more context for that comment. But in a general sense, I think had Pato not been there, you absolutely would have had a, McLaughlin Power Newgarden podium. I think McLaughlin would have given Josef a run for his money if he hadn't gotten held up behind Pato personally. Maybe Josef had some in the tank, but
or started higher up from qualifying and been in a better position to attack.
Yeah,
initially.
right. I mean, if you're talking about Palou, it's if we're talking about Palou, then we should talk about McLaughlin in the exact same context, basically.
Yep.
Power being there. I mean, in either of those guys, had the guy in front of them not been there, they would have, easily been podium contenders in a way that it didn't really strike me that anybody else was meaningfully in that same boat. Like even Colton and Pillow and, the kind of gaggle of cars, Rosenquist, that were then behind those guys didn't really, like, it seemed like they were working hard just to sort of keep up, and basically the fact that Pato was, a little bit of a roadblock, just backing everybody up, that was the only reason they were still really in touch.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess I say all that just to say, I think coming out of the first event, Penske has definitely come out swinging in ways that, and seems to have certainly have addressed some things, whether internally or with the help of Chevy, some of their weaknesses. And like I said, I think just broadly, we've seen this before, that when that happens, they're very hard to beat. And that, you kind of look at some of the other areas where they've not been great, like they've been, by their standards, very mediocre at qualifying in Indy, and been losing. And if we're just talking about championship, been losing points because of that. They figure out the street course thing and they right the ship at the speedway in qualifying. I mean, obviously Josef won the race last year, so we know they have good cars, but if they get the qualifying part of it sorted out, like, they suddenly become in exactly the same boat that we've kind of viewed Ganassi over the last couple of years as. There's just no track that they show up at that you'd bet against them, really. Mm-hmm. So, I don't have any particular reason not to think that that's going to continue to carry over.
We've got a whole load of new insight about how you watch IndyCar races anyway, with your drinking words, and maybe we should get the listeners to.
I don't actually have drinking words, but in that particular situation, I'm glad that I didn't, and I'm glad that wasn't it.
That's exactly what someone who has drinking words while they're watching an IndyCar race would say while they were on a public podcast. Get your words in for Long Beach or Thermal for what you think JR should drink to. Anyway, I can definitely add to the whole Chevy thing. I think it's not to kind of go against what you were saying, but you were right to point out the 2022 situation was like a massive drivability upgrade that completely changed like everything for them. I think it's different this year in the sense that it's like marginal gains across like a bit of everything, which is like I'm sure that's not what you weren't saying that wasn't the case, but it's just a slightly different situation in the sense that the drivers aren't saying this is one thing that has totally changed, how things are for us. But I think the interesting thing for me was that I know that both manufacturers obviously poll their teams in the off season to try and find out what they should improve on and what they should change, and that those kind of meetings happen. But from what I've heard, I don't really know how to characterize this in any other way other than that I feel like Chevrolet have been particularly aggressive this off-season about really getting into the detail of where they want their teams to improve. And like, we know that Chevrolet went to the MTC at McLaren in England and had a meeting with like 25 people around a table, including Pato and Alex Rossi. So I just say that to say that it feels like Chevrolet have like particularly gone out of their way to really drill down even more than they would have done in any other off season to try and find out where they can improve. And it looks like that's paid off. I think you can see from what the drivers are saying about it that there's not one thing, because none of them can really like agree on anywhere that it's like massively better. It's just the package seems to be improved in pretty much every area. And I think it's probably a good test for this, JR, because we had a suspicion, or we probably know from teams and drivers last year, that Honda were ahead in terms of fuel mileage. But we've just had a fuel mileage race to start the season, and we've got 4 Chevys in the top 4. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about, maybe there's not been a massive gain there, but it's definitely not held them back in this race, in a particular race where this was a thing that was needed to be successful. So an interesting kind of development, I guess. And I'm really interested to see how that plays out at other tracks and, what those kind of gains mean. Maybe they're not worth as much at other places. Maybe they're worth twice as much at other places. We don't really know until we get there. So it's going to be an interesting topic to follow throughout the season. Anyway, we mentioned Romain Grosjean a little bit earlier on. I want to get into him and Andretti a little bit, because I think there's kind of like two camps with Andretti. Either people thought it was going to be much of the same, kind of what we've seen for the past few years, or people thought they were like maybe immediately going to be really successful, or that they were going to rock up and have a chance to be really good. And 2 cars in the Fast Six in qualifying, I'd say that's a good start. We know that they've been, strong in qualifying at St Pete before, so I guess kind of preface all of this with the fact that we know Andretti has been quick at St Pete, and it's not been a particular, it's definitely not been a track where they've struggled at, or one of their worst tracks. So I think we were expecting them to come here and be successful. We didn't see the kind of the sheer pace that we saw out of Penske, but I think there was a few themes there. Obviously, Marcus Ericsson qualifying in the Fast Six on a street course is a good thing to see for them, a good start for him. And I thought Colton and Kyle Kirkwood were really fantastic in the race. I thought there was moments where Colton could have definitely put his car in a position where he didn't need to be. I felt like Kyle obviously had a poor qualifying. I think Michael Andretti put that down to a bad set of tyres in qualifying. But equally in the race, I don't think the camera really cut to Kirkwood like more than once or twice in the whole race. And I took that as a really good thing. He was back in the pack in places where in previous seasons we've seen him make mistakes or be part of incidents, get caught up in things that he doesn't need to be getting caught up in. And in actual fact, was able to turn that kind of poor qualifying into a 12th place, which is exactly the kind of thing that people have been critical of Kyle of in the past. Not taking those results when they come. Obviously 12th isn't where he wants to finish, but not overdriving, not forcing anything. And I felt the same out of Colton. And there was a moment I thought of you actually in the first stint where Felix and Joseph kind of checked out a little bit, and Colton was maybe like between 2.5 and 3 seconds back. And I thought, Colton's just saving his stuff here. He's just managing, and that's definitely something that people have been critical of him about, is overdriving, wearing the tyres out early in a stint, trying to force stuff that isn't there. And, I'm sure he won't want to have finished 5th. Obviously, he took the hard tyres in the final part of qualifying, which probably cost him a chance at fighting for pole there. That wasn't the right decision in hindsight, but he's turned a difficult weekend where they weren't the fastest car into a 5th place, was exactly what he needs to do to start his season and kind of be in position to fight in the championship. Marcus had to retire through reasons that were not actually, I don't think they've actually got to the bottom of it yet. Speaking on Sunday night after the race, they lost drive basically, but they weren't sure whether it was like an engine issue or an electrical issue. But that put him out while he was running 7th. So I think he would have been in, contention for that top 5 as well. So a pretty good start for Marcus Ericsson, all things considered. I don't think it could have been much better in terms of what they brought to the table. On Romain Grosjean's side, I thought a fantastic start qualifying, in the Fast Six for Juncos. We're not seeing that very often. We have seen it done, but not particularly often. We know Grosjean's, absolutely fantastic at St Pete. And I kind of thought a similar thing about Romain as I did about Colton and Kyle in the first part of the race. He did drop back, but I was kind of thinking, have Juncos really made such a step that they're able to compete with all these guys in the top like 5, 6? I was thinking they're probably by the end of the race going to be somewhere around 10th, maybe outside the top 10. That's probably where their pace is going to be with Romain. And yeah, I mean, he was upset that, Romain was upset that he'd not been aggressive enough in the early part of the race. He'd lost some positions, especially at the start. But then he had an incident at turn 10 where he kind of made a half move on Linus Lundqvist, dived down the inside and then took Linus out. And then later on he had a gearbox problem that took him out of the race completely. I think we basically saw all of the good and bad of signing Romain Grosjean for an IndyCar team, I think. You saw the brilliant qualifying performance. The team were absolutely over the moon. You could see in Ricardo Juncos and Brad Hollinger when they were kind of walking around the paddock, or if they were interviewed or whatever, how happy they were with their start and how good qualifying had been. I thought Romain was having a fantastic race where didn't do anything wrong really in that first phase. And I think if he'd have just finished like basically anywhere inside the top 15, but just looking who was like 15th, 14th, 13th, he was miles ahead of any of those people like for the first part of the race. I think he was definitely like going to be around 10th towards the end of the race if he hadn't had his incidents. So up until that point, perfect, but then makes a silly mistake that takes the points away and puts the car out. I don't know if the gearbox issue was related to the Linus incident. I'd be very surprised if it was, because he'd obviously touched the front wing hit his wheel of Linus Lundqvist's car, and that's not going to cause any gearbox damage, I don't think. But still, very disappointing to see that, and I think it's kind of made me feel a bit meh about how that year is going to play out, because it felt, obviously that car finished in the top 5 last year in St. Pete, so it's not like they're terrible at St. Pete. They were going to turn up as long as they hadn't fallen backwards compared to all of the other teams and be relatively competitive, especially with Romain being so good at St. Pete. But it does make me wonder how many positions he's going to be in like that, where if there's one race not to do that, it's your first race with a new team. It's if you did it halfway through the year, at the end of the year, I feel like it would be less reason to be so fixated on it. But the fact that it's happened in the first race where you want to, not make any silly mistakes and give a good showing of yourself, I thought that was quite disappointing. But I'm sure he bounced back with the pace that we expect to see from him. Anything you picked up on Romain or Marcus that you wanted to jump in on? I know they both had complicated weekends based on how the race played out.
I think I would just say that, I thought I was, I think if I was Marcus, I'd be super encouraged by the weekend. So I got the fact that he was in the top 6, and just had pace all the way around. I mean, like last year we talked about, we gave Alexander Rossi an entire season to seem like he was kind of on pace with Pato or whatever, and just from switching teams, and so I think for Marcus to be just right on the money right away, he was quickest, I think, in his group in the first round of qualifying, right? I mean, or whatever was first or second quickest. Just we've talked about how, we think Andretti on street courses as a team has arguably the fastest package, just for one lap pace. It just sort of seems, or they're certainly right there with anybody else on a given day on a street course. And with Marcus being at Ganassi for so long, we don't have much data kind of on. All we can do is compare him to Scott and Alex Palou. So we don't really know, where so him going to Andretti tells us something about those guys. It tells us something about him. It tells us something about Andretti that we kind of don't already know. And obviously there's a lot of variables in terms of how you kind of rate all of those things year to year, that it's not ever apples to apples, but, see him get in that thing and just be obviously click with the way that Andretti's setup philosophy works, and just get right down to business, I think is huge. So I'm sort of, it makes me very intrigued to see, what he kind of can scrape together out of other results over the course of the year. I think that, so I was impressed with his performance over the course of the weekend. And obviously, like you said, I mean, whatever, he doesn't get the result, but that's neither here nor there, really. For Grosjean, I guess the only thing I would say to, maybe with a slightly different perspective than yours is, I think the things that Romain did wrong or didn't do well or something this weekend, at least were a very different way of things not going well. He lost a bunch of spots on the start because he was kind of conservative, just breaking into the first corner. And he ends up in this incident with Linus basically because he just decides to bail out of a pass. I think kind of trying not to force the issue, basically, was how I read it. When I just watching the incident, I was he kind of had it in his head that he was going to, stick it in on him, and then decided I don't really want to cause that. I might not get there, and I don't want to cause a huge crash. And sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes you end up causing an accident anyway, which is what happened. And so it ends up looking bad. But I guess just to see him be on the other foot, kind of, at least in terms of how things, unfortunately it just didn't quite, that being that far on the other end of the spectrum, on like the conservative side of the spectrum, didn't work any better than being like too far on the other side of the spectrum, which is more what we're used to seeing. But
Yeah.
I guess that gives me a little bit of like, oh, well, that's it. That's for sure something different than what we've seen. And so, if he like gets somewhere kind of back in the middle of that spectrum, maybe he does. Maybe we do end up seeing like for real the best of both worlds. I mean, even when he was at Coin, it was more like that. More often than not, it was that he was just out there doing his thing, and it seemed very purposeful or something. Like that he wasn't in over his head, but he also wasn't being overly conservative. And they ended up accruing a lot of strong results in an otherwise like in a team and in a situation that like maybe didn't deserve that or something. And so you definitely got the sense that at Coin, like, Romain was bringing a lot to the table to produce those results in those situations. And so I guess, watching him through the weekend this weekend made me, although to your points, like it didn't really end up going that well, but kind of made me think the same, just for watching the rest of the year. And generally speaking, I mean, I would agree, like, it's not like, he's been really good at St. Pete, and that car has been good in race trim at St. Pete before. So, they're gonna be more up and down than, how we think about Newgarden or Colton or something at those bigger teams, I think, for over the duration of the year. But in a general sense, I thought like, okay, I mean, this is bummer that it just like didn't really end up going that well. But there's basically two situations in the race for him because they lost spots in pit stops. Like, there were some things he had nothing to do with that, were part of what kind of ticked him down the order. But yeah, anyway, I definitely I think there's a way to look at his race that was more, optimistic, I think, about where they end up going for the rest of the year, assuming that they just kind of he makes the right adjustments and they make the right adjustments. And again, I think that they're obviously on our kind of top 5 stories for the year, and I think I've got no reason to change that. Basically, just after one race, I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do together and how that shakes out.
I get that, and there is a more positive way to look at it than probably I laid out. I think additionally, there's been a lot of talk about that team and the kind of the negativity around Callum Ilott leaving the team, and I've had to write about that a lot and quite often get accused of British bias in that scenario, having written a lot about Callum over that time. But I genuinely do want to see that team do well, and I think part of that kind of negativity about how this weekend's gone for them is that they had 3 top 10s last year, and St. Pete was one of them. That you have to maximize his opportunities, and if we're gonna listen to drivers every week talking about how close the series is and how tight everything is, you've got to maximize his opportunities, and you can't have any sort of sentimentality or like, I don't think you can have any other way of looking at it. This was a massive missed opportunity for that team to potentially make a big difference in their leader circle at the end of the year. And I'll preface that by saying that I'm not saying this is because Callum did some sort of incredible thing at St. Pete last year, because we had the 7-car pile up at the start of the race that took quite a few of his competitors out of the race. And that's not to say that he didn't do a great job. It's just to say that was a very different race where a lot of different things happened. And I think a 10th for Hunkos in that race would have been just as good as a 5th for Callum last year, in the sense that there was far less kind of adversity going on for Romain, but he had to manage a race on pure performance against a lot of very good teams and drivers in a different way to perhaps how Callum got his race across the line in St. Pete last year. So just a massive missed opportunity, and disappointing for that team, because I know how hard they've worked in the off season, and how much effort they've put into turning things around this year. And I actually think they deserve a lot of credit for, yes, they finished 5th last year, but they weren't a 5th place qualifying car last year by any stretch of the imagination. So as much as Romain's put, we know how good he is at St. Pete. We've said it quite a few times already, but he doesn't qualify there without the car being there for him either. And that means that Juncos have done a fantastic job at putting that car underneath him. So props to them. I hope that I'm wrong in my characterization of how that race played out and what it might mean for the year, but it did feel like a massive missed opportunity anyway. And that's about all there is to say on that topic, I think. I wanted to round up a couple of other things very, very quickly. We couldn't leave this episode without mentioning Meyer Shank with Felix Rosenqvist breaking the lap record or track record even at St. Pete in the second Q2 in qualifying. Really strong performance. I think there's a lot of people getting really excited about Felix and Meyer Shank now. Maybe that soured a little bit after the race where he finished in 7th. After qualifying second, obviously dropped quite a few places. And in that last pit stop, he was especially jumped by a couple of cars there. Probably deserved to be a top 5 car, really. Just didn't quite have the pace in the last stint and lost a bit of time with pit stops, especially to Herta. He lost 2 seconds in the first pit stop, I think. I saw a graphic that they put on the TV for that. Obviously, we're only talking about this a couple of hours after the race. We haven't had time to go back into the in and out laps and all that kind of stuff yet, but definitely a lot of encouragement. I think the one thing I will say is that team has been very, very good on street courses generally. It hasn't had the results recently that probably support that or show that to its maximum. But I guess this is not to say that they're not going to be good this season, just that I'm very interested to see how they get on when we get away from the street courses and move towards road courses and ovals. Obviously, Andretti's form will have a little bit of a factor there because they obviously take some of Andretti's equipment and engineering knowledge and stuff like that. So that'll play a bit of a role. If Andretti have taken a step forward on ovals or road courses or both, then that should feed back to Meyer Shank. So it's going to be interesting. But anyway, he just looked like he was right at the sharp end straight away and looked really sharp from the start of the race and was under a lot of pressure for a lot of that race, really, from various different people in different circumstances, and was obviously hamstrung a little bit by a pit stop or two, but was fairly cool under pressure. And for the person who had the most DNFs last year, he seemed to handle that pretty calmly and pretty well against some very sharp opposition. So that was interesting. Rahal Esmalan again as well also had what an unusual race for them, and I'm trying to sum it up in a way that is meaningful in any sort of way, but it feels difficult because it was just a bit all over the place. But Graham Rahal had a downshift issue that they couldn't fix at the track, so that kind of hampered him throughout his whole race, and he ended up doing 3 pit stops and ended up 16th, 1 spot behind his rookie teammate Pietro Fittipaldi. He was in that kind of gaggle of cars that were at the back of the race, but managed to move forward kind of late on and pick up a top 15. So that was probably, I'd say, a good start. But I think generally the pace was just not quite there for anyone other than Lundgaard, and even Lundgaard struggled. Obviously, that puncture taking him out early was disappointing for him, and he was just really appeared to be quite downcast after qualifying that he hadn't been able to qualify higher up, and seemed generally quite pessimistic about things. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, they have struggled there in the past, Rahal, so I think it was probably one place Christian was probably hoping to come to and see a big improvement or some gains, and they've probably not quite been able to do that. I didn't think the pace was too far off, but yeah, generally just not a great race for them. And I guess just finishing up the kind of roundup, I thought we can't really go any further without kind of talking about the off-track stuff. A couple of stories bouncing around about team owners not being happy about things. I think Michael Andretti triggered that to Nathan Brown of the Indy Star, saying that Michael was saying that he didn't think that, I don't want to talk about this without quoting it because it's like, I don't want to be, like misrepresenting what's been said, but critical of some of the decision making that's been made by IndyCar in recent times. And we also saw then Chip Ganassi defend Roger Penske as well. I think that was to Joey Barnes of motorsport.com. So an interesting kind of back and two going on. And I think, personally, a lot of this comes down to the trying to hammer through a charter for the teams. I think that's partly causing quite a lot of the angst behind the scenes personally from, people I've spoke to and from things I understand, mainly because IndyCar is desperate not to give the charter teams who sign up a guaranteed qualification for the Indy 500, because that goes against, the history and an element of the pageantry of the Indy 500 is, bump day and the difficulty of qualifying for the race and being part of it. IndyCar know how the fans will react to that. We've seen a little bit of a microcosm of that with a story that, again, Nathan Brown from IndyStar ran over the off season about it being a possibility that charter teams could get an automatic pass to the 500, and some of the replies and some of the fan reaction to that was definitely not positive. And I know Mark Miles had addressed the media. I was part of that call not long before the season started, and he said he was, he'd grown up in Indianapolis and was well aware of what the fans would make of a system where people didn't qualify for the Indy 500. He was well aware of what that metric might look like. But then you have to ask what the team owners get for the charter system and what the value is if it's not a guaranteed qualifying for the Indy 500, because obviously that guarantees the sponsorship and various promotional elements of teams that they need to make things work. So I personally, and speaking to a few people I know, they share the same kind of sentiment that this is behind a lot of the kind of angst at the moment. But there is obviously wider problems with what we've seen through the off-season. We talked about a lot on the pod. You can go back and listen to some of the other podcasts, the hybrid delay and the cost of that, being a big part of the kind of upset, and also certain teams not getting as much testing as other teams with the hybrid unit that's going to be introduced midway through the year, and there's going to be no way that some of those teams are going to be able to catch up that testing time. So a lot going on at the moment. Mark Miles said that he was hopeful that on-track action would distract from that. So we'll definitely see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think more broadly, even than, Indy 500 entries is, but although that is when you break it into the smaller details of how IndyCar teams generate value, that's certainly a big part of it. And so that's why it's such a sticking point, or why it's such a conversational topic. But I think more generally, and I think Michael's public comments speak to this, even if he didn't kind of phrase it in quite this way, is there's a lot of questions around just fundamentally what's the value proposition here to being an IndyCar team, and how are we creating that, and how are we growing it? And that's true. I mean, that's a totally fair set of questions to ask of any business or any sports league or any whatever. And so I think fundamentally, like, that's a question that's being asked by not only the teams in this context, but it's why Honda is having the, pushback that has generated the pushback that they have. It's why even Chevrolet is like kind of, I think, sitting here like, what are we doing? Like, where are we all going here? The drivers have the same question. So I guess I bring it up in part to say, you're going to ask these questions all the time because you're constantly trying, regard whether it's going great or it's not. People in Formula One are asking these same questions. Like, it's not like this is unique to IndyCar that people are trying to like identify truly what the value proposition of being in the sport is. But the other aspect of that is trying to understand what that value proposition is going to be on a 5 to 10 year horizon. And I think that to me is really where Michael's comments spoke loud and clear, and where I personally agree is there's no outline, there's no roadmap for what like the 5 to 10 year value proposition is that really is anything that is being built with a mindset beyond IndyCar racing is currently great, so we're just going to try to keep it great. And that's a very one-dimensional point of view of like how sports businesses work and what matters in like a modern era of media and media rights and all of this stuff that factors into not just the direct revenue that teams and sanctioning bodies are pulling in, but kind of the secondary revenues that get associated with their sponsorships and all the rest of it. And so I think there are sort of two fundamental schools of thought here within IndyCar, or to do with IndyCar. One that I think some of the teams and whatever share in this is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Kind of like, we have what we think is a great racing product. Like, let's just try to tweak on as many other little things as we can to bolster that. There's another point of view, which I think is, I'll just reference Michael, because he was the one that actually came out and said something, which is more where Michael's coming from, which is like, if we remain stagnant, we're going to lose, basically. Like that we'll just get eaten alive by Formula One, and our ratings will never go up. And if I'm trying to grow a business, if I'm trying to really grow a business here domestically, like, this might not be how I'm going to do it then at that point, And so, and it's interesting also thinking about some of the context for that. Like, Michael's got, because of the Formula One deal, Michael's got a whole bunch of new investors that are like investing. Like, this isn't just like we're doing this for fun. We're trying to grow something that's going to be worth, if you're in venture capital, you're not looking for a 1.5x gain over 5 or 10 years. You're looking for like 100x gain over 10 years. And so I think there's just fundamentally kind of I think if you asked a lot of people, they'd say there's room for IndyCar to 10x in terms of its attention, in terms of its value, in terms of, its value as a sporting property. It's independent of the Indianapolis 500, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, all of this kind of stuff. I certainly believe that, but there are fairly, very different perspectives on what's actually required for that change to happen. And I think I'm certainly on this of the camp that like a lot needs to change in order for that to happen. But some kind of aren't, I think. And so that's where we get into this, like, Michael referenced a couple of the sort of financial aspects of this whole thing that, you'll buy, the one of the kind of hypothesis here with I think the whatever the franchised entries is, the teams will buy in $1 million a piece. So there's going to be roughly, one of the versions of it is that you'll buy into this system, that, you'll have 20-ish teams that'll buy into the system, 20-ish entries that'll buy into the system. And then that makes for, okay, the series has got an extra $20 million. Michael's clear perspective on that, because he just came out and said it, was like, that's just basically insignificant in terms of like investment back into the series. Like, that doesn't really move the needle in any particular direction in terms of us really doing the things that we need to do for my business to get on like a series, to hit like a knee in a growth curve, that this thing really starts to blow up. And so, it's interesting now we've had these kind of under the radar, or like, there's been rumblings of these kinds of points of view from within the paddock, whether they be on the manufacturer side or the team side. So the fact that, I think more broadly, if we just zoom out a little bit, the fact that these things are now becoming public forum discussions kind of, to me says people are getting frustrated with their voices not being heard in the back room. Like, this is not the first time that Michael has said this about IndyCar. He's probably just getting sick of nobody seeming like they're paying attention. And so as much as I don't like kind of sitting here, and I don't even really like pointing these things out, because I think the world of motorsports is better with IndyCar in it than without it, whatever version of it is. So, I try to keep that in mind, but it's hard to argue with some of the comments that are being made, and from the general point of view that, that even Honda, like if you look at it from their perspective, like they've back to the very beginning of the pod, like kind of just been doing the exact same thing in the IndyCar series for like 12 years. So can you blame them for kind of just on the general principle of kind of being bored with that same thing and feeling like, are we really getting much value out of this anymore? We've won a bunch of Indy 500s, we won a bunch of championships. We don't have anything new to talk about. Like, if you the rationale behind the decision making for these things is usually more complicated than that. But like, if I just put it in those terms, it's kind of hard to argue with, really, or it's certainly hard to find like super faulty logic in terms of asking for things to be more different, regardless of what you think about how they're going about it or whatever else. So, these are questions that just, they're going to need to get addressed, because that sentiment is not going to go away.
I think fundamentally, however you look at things, the fact that there was a meeting between all of the teams and IndyCar less than a month ago, and that these comments are still being made in public, and there's an element of, Michael's been asked a question about the future of IndyCar, and he's given an honest answer about how he feels about it. It would probably be to read too much into it to say that, he's necessarily sought this out, or that it's a topic that he's desperate to get into the public domain. But he's also not scared to obviously answer the question honestly either. And the fact that he has
the fact that he even just answered it is different, right? Like, he's been asked that question a bunch and has probably thought the same thing about it for quite some time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And that pales in comparison to someone like Honda saying, we're going to leave the series if you don't cut the costs. Like, that is as negative as a public statement you could possibly make, is that we are so sure that this series isn't going in the right direction that we will pull out of it if you do not change things. Like, if that's not a call to arms to listen to what people are suggesting, even if you don't do all of those things that those people are suggesting, like, if you don't make them feel heard, then I think that says that you're not doing enough to appease all of the parties. And it's never an easy thing to do, and especially in any series where you're trying to, motorsport in generally is just always trying to second guess what the automotive market's doing and what manufacturers want to do and what they're trying to achieve, whether it be marketing or to be more relevant to consumers or whatever it is. Like, it's never even just as simple as trying to appeal to, all of the manufacturers, because they all want different things from how they go about racing. So it's just, it's not an easy thing. And I agree with you. I don't think anyone wants to talk about this in public, and I would caution people to be too harsh towards IndyCar because they're spinning a lot of plates and trying to not let them all smash. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who are not happy with how things are going and have made that very clear in public, and not just any old people. They're very key stakeholders in the future of the championship. So, yeah,
the only thing I would just add super quick is that I think that it's important to say that anybody from within the series or within the community of the series or the ecosystem of the series, that is voicing opinions, it's because I'll speak for myself, because I've been, critical at times of kind of where we're going, or at least have suggested sort of similar things. Like, we need to be thinking like a little bigger here, in terms of like what's going to actually do the things that we think are possible to do in terms of growth. That like, in my mind, it's because I want Scott Dixon and Josef Newgarden to go down as two of the greatest race car drivers in the history of motorsports and like be recognized for how good they are. It's because I want these badass tracks that we go to get their due in terms of where they really sit in the, in the broader motorsport landscape. You want for the things that IndyCar stands for and does showcase, just to be showcased enough and to enough people, and for that to resonate broadly enough that it really feels like it matters, and so it's out of I think ultimately like I think everybody's on the same page in terms of what we want out of this. Like, we want for IndyCar to succeed. We want for IndyCar to succeed in a big way. And it just feels like there's kind of a difference. There's broadly a difference of opinion in terms of what some folks feel like is required to do that, and others. And I think along with that, there's sort of a varying sense of like urgency for, or how much urgency is required to address that, in order to see some of these things happen in a meaningful way. So I guess as a little bit of clarity for like anybody for fans who are seeing people talk about this kind of stuff, for fans who are listening to us talk about this, it's really just out of like, from my perspective, it's because I think we need to get with the fucking program. And like, if we're going to do some things for IndyCar to really be as big of a deal as we think it should be, like we've spent, for all of us, you talk about the Dallara DW12 as being its 200th race. Like, for a lot of the guys that are currently in the championship that we think of as being like some of the best in the world, they've spent their entire careers just driving this one car in the same way. Like, there has to be some turnover, some change, some newness. You need to be able to let these guys showcase what they can really do on a different kind of scale, on a different type of stage, in order for some of these things to just hit home with people, and so I guess as a race car driver myself, like, even if I take myself out of that picture in terms of being an active driver or something, there's a lot of us that kind of, or I can at least speak for myself, I sort of get the feeling that it's like, I've just like missed out on this whole experience that you hear about guys having had of driving like just these wicked machines and all this kind of stuff, because we're just coming back to the super refined situation that doesn't change year after year after year. And so I think there's something just inherent in the way that makes you feel, because it's just the way that the sport's been for as long as a lot of us can remember. That it's kind of like, this just isn't it. Like, regardless of how close we think the racing is and how much we think that matters, like, there's just more to it than that.
I think all of those things and all of the things we've discussed still exist. I would say that Mark Miles did address the media recently and gave some kind of, probably the first updates we've had in a little while in terms of like responses to some of these big questions that IndyCar have been asked all the way through the off season and haven't really had an answer to, or have decided not to publicly address. They have now done that in some cases. So you can head to the-race.com and read a feature with a lot of what Mark Miles had to say about where the series is going and what IndyCar's kind of at least rough plan for the future is in terms of some of its big pieces, like a new car, for example. So you can go and find out more about that on the-race.com, where you can find all of your news, features, and analysis. I think that's all for this week's episode. We've ran massively over, but hopefully this big budget episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast will satisfy all of your wants and desires from St Petersburg. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.